Hi, I'm Troy Clare. My cameraman is Larry Clare. We're here to honor our family and present to all of us who have a common ancestor in George W. Reed. This is the headstone of George W. Reed and his wife, Frances. Her maiden name is Myers. And starting out, they both were born well, George was born in Ohio, and Frances was born in Pennsylvania, in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And George was born in Navarre, Ohio. And the Reeds, before they were married, came to Ohio as a pioneer farming family, and there was several siblings, and George was one of the middle siblings, and they settled in Ohio when Ohio was still first being opened up and land was being offered to people to head west on the western migration. The Reed family were involved in one of the oldest churches of God, grassroots churches that came out during the Revolutionary War time out of New England, and that thought was in support of abolition. They thought that slavery was wrong. So when the Civil War came, Abraham Lincoln called for troops, and George, being a middle child, felt that he could join a regiment to fight in the Civil War. He was 20 years old. He joined the 76th Ohio, and since it came out of Canton, Ohio, he was in Company K, and every company came from a certain community. So his came from Company K, officially Canton, Ohio. So George, being a single young man, 20 years old, he went into basic training further east in Ohio in November of 1861. We have pictures of George in a Civil War kepi hat and a Union blue tunic in black and white, of course. And if you see what's posted, it's a copy of a tintype. So it's amazing the kind of clarity that you can get from a copy like that. So he went to basic training, and by this time the Battle of Bull Run had been fought and done, and the Western theater of the Civil War was developing. General Grant was coming into his own, and he deployed with his regiment to Tennessee, and he joined up with Grant's operations at the Battle of Fort Donelson, which is at the top of the border of Tennessee and Kentucky. So he fought in the Battle of Fort Donelson, and he moved on and fought in the Battle of Shiloh, where things got a little more hot as far as the battle goes. Shiloh was a very pivotal battle in helping the United States realize that this war was not a flash in the pan. It was going to go on for years. So our relative George, he found himself, he had volunteered for 3 years, and he was in for the duration, as far as he knew. So they moved on to, after Shiloh, they pushed the Confederates out of Tennessee into Mississippi, where they stood at the Battle of Corinth. And then once the Union defeated the Confederates at Corinth, and they retreated further south, they started maneuvering around Tennessee. They ended up in Memphis for a while, and then Grant set his focus on Vicksburg. Now this took a long time to get to Vicksburg, because this is 1862, and they didn't actually do anything to Vicksburg significantly until 1863. So there's a lot of swamp duty, marching, drinking mud for water, all kinds of hardships that he went through as a young man. At least At least he didn't have a family to worry about, except for his mom and dad and his siblings. So, with his buddies from Canton, he slogged on, and they eventually, over time, marched down south, crossed the Mississippi, and headed up to Vicksburg, which wasn't an easy thing, and they fought several battles. The Union Army fought several battles before they even got in front of Vicksburg. But by the time they started heading to Vicksburg, George's brother got drafted for 9 months, so he joined his brother. His brother joined the company, and they were in the same company as they marched down to Vicksburg. And they stood at the Battle of Vicksburg, fought in two assaults on Vicksburg, and then settled on the bluffs of Vicksburg to hold the siege. And then once Vicksburg fell, they left Vicksburg, and just shortly nearby, his brother Henry was discharged, and he went back home to Ohio, and George had to slog on the rest of his term alone again. So then things moved on to Chattanooga, Tennessee, where they had to push General Bragg out of Chattanooga into Georgia, and then they fought a final battle of 1864, early 1864 in Georgia, before they went into winter camp, where 76 Ohio really got tore up. And then the 76 Ohio went into winter camp, and before that winter time was over with, George got sent to a Veterans Reserve Corps regiment, which is like an invalid corps, or for soldiers who couldn't campaign vigorously anymore, or that they were too wounded or too sick, they were sent there. So George went to what was called Washington City, which is Washington, D.C. today, and he joined his Veterans Reserve Corps and was basically doing fort duty, holding Washington. So here he was going to finish up his 3-year term and go home. But the Confederates had other plans, and General Early decided he was going to make an assault on Washington. So his regiment was called up to stand against General Early's assault from the north of Washington. So Early had maneuvered around to the north of Washington, and here our relative George had to stand with his regiment one more battle when he probably thought he had it easier. So they stood against General Early. They distinguished themselves again, and the regiment is credited with taking a couple thousand Confederate prisoners, and then General Early was pretty much done, and all the focus of the Civil War went back to Richmond and Petersburg. So our relative finished the summer and into the winter at Washington, and then his term of enlistment ended in November of 1864, and he went back home to Ohio. And it was in 1865, January 1865, he married his Frances, and they began their married life together. And so I thought that was impressive. He married his wife before the war was over. Young man, probably well vetted from the war, and now he gets to come home, but he married and he was going to start his life. So shortly thereafter, they moved to Indiana, into the Fort Wayne area where we stand, and they started their life. They had children, and they lost 2 of their children, and they're buried north of Fort Wayne. And eventually they moved on to Missouri, And somewhere in there, Frances passed away and she was buried here. And George went on to Missouri with a couple of his children, his sons, and they were in Missouri where they settled new land. And that is where George joined the GAR, which is the Grand Army of the Republic, which is a fraternity for Civil War soldiers to keep in touch with each other. And he was a member of a chapter in northern Missouri. So then when he passed away, he was brought back and was buried here. And I looked into his life and his Civil War career, and I was just very impressed. He was a staunch veteran. He was proud of his service because he joined the GAR. He raised his family. He was a pioneer in many aspects. And then he was buried next to his wife back in Indiana. And I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you get a sense of our family from our branch of the Reeds. And that's why I talked to you today.